Howdy, folks, and pull up a seat here at Grit and Gunsmoke. The West was a place of vast, beautiful lies. It promised fortune, freedom, and a new start. But for most, it delivered only dust, blood, and a shallow grave. Before we ride into this tale of a woman forged in the crucible of that very lie, do me a solid and rustle up that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single shot. Now, listen close. This is the story of Lena Harper, a name the world tried to forget, and the woman who would burn that world down to make sure they remembered. The memory of her husband, John Harper, was the last truly warm thing Lena had ever known. It was the scent of wood smoke and worn leather, the sound of a low, easy laugh that could gentle the most skittish cold, the feel of his calloused hand enveloping hers. John was a legend, a gunslinger whose name was whispered with a mix of fear and reverence from the saloons of Dodge City to the mining camps of the Arizona Territory. To the world, he was a thunderclap. To Lena, he was the quiet safety of a campfire under a blanket of stars. He was home, and then home was gone. His death was a whisper, a mystery as vast and empty as the desert itself. He rode out one morning to meet an informant. He'd said about a final score that would let them buy that ranch in Montana. He never came back. The sheriff found his horse wandering alone a week later, and his body 2 days after that, half buried in a shallow arroyo, stripped of his iconic twin Colts. The official story was bandits. Lena knew better. The ghosts of a man like John Harper don't just fade away. They come back to collect. They came for her a month later. There were 4 of them, their faces hard masks of grit and cruelty, their eyes holding the cold, dead light of predators. They didn't knock. They kicked the door of her small homestead off its hinges, the splintering wood an echo of her life shattering. The leader was a man with a jagged scar that split his left eyebrow, and his name, she would later learn, was Silas Kane. He was the ghost-in-chief of her husband's past. Mrs. Harper, Silas had sneered, his voice like gravel grinding on bone. Your husband owed us something, and since he ain't here to pay, we figure his property will do. They tore the homestead apart, searching for a stash of money that didn't exist. Their frustration mounted, turning into a storm of brutal violence directed at her. They were not just men, they were a force of nature, a plague of locusts in human form. Lena fought with the desperate fury of a cornered cat, but she was no match for them. The pain was a red fog, a symphony of agony. A boot to the ribs, the sharp crack of a bone in her arm, the sting of a backhand that split her lip and filled her mouth with the coppery taste of blood. Through it all Silas watched, his eyes dispassionate, as if observing livestock. When they were done, and she was a broken, bleeding heap on the floorboards of her ruined home, Silas knelt beside her. He grabbed a fistful of her hair, forcing her to look at him. So you remember this face, he whispered, his breath foul. We ain't killing you. That'd be a mercy. We're just bracing you. The desert can have what's left. They dragged her limp body out to a wagon, rode for what felt like an eternity under the merciless sun, and then threw her out into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the salt flats. They took her water, her shoes, and her hope. The last thing she saw was the 4 of them, laughing as they rode away, leaving her to the sun and the vultures. Death, she discovered, was not a sudden event. It was a slow, meticulous process. The sun was the first tormentor, a blacksmith's forge in the sky, beating down on her, blistering her skin, boiling the very thoughts from her head. It was a carrion sun, picking at her flesh before she was even a corpse. Thirst was the second tormentor, a physical being that lived in her throat, a demon made of sand and fire that clawed at her from the inside out. Her tongue swelled, her lips cracked and bled. She crawled. Her broken arm screamed, her ribs felt like a cage of shattered daggers. But she crawled. She didn't know where she was going, only that to stop moving was to surrender. Delirium became her companion. She saw John, standing just ahead, holding a canteen, beckoning her forward with that easy smile. She'd crawl towards him, her fingers dry and bleeding, only for him to dissolve into the heat haze. Days bled into one another. The sun rose and set in a blaze of orange and purple, and caring. The buzzards began to circle, their shadows gliding over her like a benediction of the damned. They were patient. She had accepted it. This was her grave, a vast and marked plot of cracked earth. Her last coherent thought was a prayer of pure, unadulterated hatred a curse aimed at the laughing faces of the men who had done this to her. She closed her eyes, ready for the end. But the end did not come. Instead, there was the sound of a horse's slow, deliberate steps. A shadow fell over her, a blessed relief from the sun's tyranny. She managed to crack an eyelid open. A figure loomed over her, a tall, lean silhouette against the blinding sky. He wore a long, dark duster, and the brim of his hat was pulled low, hiding his face. He dismounted, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted motion. He knelt beside her, not with pity, but with the detached curiosity of a man examining a strange insect. He was older, his face a landscape of hard lines and sun-baked leather, with eyes the color of faded slate. They were the coldest eyes Lena had ever seen, colder than a snake's, colder than the grave she had been preparing for. He prodded her shoulder with the toe of his boot. A small, pained whimper escaped her lips. Still breathing, he rasped, his voice as dry as the desert floor. He pulled a canteen from his saddle, and corked it, and poured a small trickle of water onto her cracked lips. It was agony and ecstasy, a fire that both burned and soothed. She coughed, her body convulsing. "Who?" she managed to whisper. "Name's Cole," he said, taking a step back to survey her, his eyes missing nothing: broken arm, the brutalized face, the raw determination that had allowed her to crawl this far. Bounty hunter. He wasn't saving her out of kindness. She could see it in his clinical gaze. He was assessing her, weighing her, like a piece of equipment. "They left you for dead," he stated, not asked. "Four of them. Silas Kane's crew. Passed their tracks a mile back." The Namasila's canoe was a spark on dry tinder. In the wreckage of her mind, a single, hot flame ignited. Hate, pure and perfect. Her eyes, sunken and clouded with pain, focused on him. Cole saw it. He saw the flicker of hellfire in their depths. He saw the woman who had died, and the thing that was refusing to let her body follow. A flicker of something that might have been interest crossed his features. "Most folks would just lay down and die," he said, his voice flat. "But you crawled. You got hate in your eyes. That's good. Hate can be useful. It's a better tool than any gun, if you know how to aim it." He fell silent for a long moment, the only sound the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Lena watched him, her life hanging on the thread of this cold stranger's next words. "I can help you," Cole said finally. "I can patch you up. I can teach you. Teach you how to hold a gun, how to track, how to kill. I can turn you into the ghost they thought they'd made. But it'll cost you. It'll cost you everything you were. I won't be saving a wife or a homesteader. I'll be forging a weapon." He extended a leather-gloved hand. "The choice is yours. You can lie here and let the sun finish the job, or you can take my hand and become the reckoning this land has been waiting for." Lena looked at his outstretched hand. She thought of John's warm, safe grip. This man's hand offered no comfort, no safety. It offered only pain, blood, and a cold, singular purpose. It offered a future she never wanted, but it was the only future she had left. With a surge of strength born from the depths of her newfound hatred, Lena Harper reached out her one good hand and took his. Her grip was weak, but her will was iron. As his fingers closed around hers, she felt the last vestiges of the woman she had been burned away under the carrion sun, leaving only a hollow space waiting to be filled with vengeance. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent home invasion. Pain was the first intruder, kicking down the door to her mind. It was a chorus of agony, the sharp, grinding torment of her broken arm, the deep, throbbing ache in her ribs with every shallow breath, and the sandpaper rasp of a throat that had forgotten the memory of water. The second intruder was a cold so profound it felt elemental, a cold that had seeped into her bones while she lay cooking under the desert sun. Lena's eyes fluttered open to a world of murky brown. She was lying on a rough cot, a single, coarse wool blanket scratching at her blistered skin. Above her, the ceiling was made of thick and hewn logs, the gaps chinked with mud and straw. The air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and a sharp, antiseptic scent of herbs that made her nose wrinkle. A small, sputtering fire in a stone hearth at the far end of the room provided the only light and a meager, losing battle against the encroaching chill. The cabin was the physical embodiment of the man who had brought her here. There was no comfort in it, only brutal functionality. A rough plank table and two stools stood in the center. A sparse collection of iron pots and tin plates were stacked on a crude shelf. A long rifle and a shotgun were mounted on the wall, meticulously clean. There was no art, no rug, no cushion. It was less a home and more a den, a place for a predator to rest between hunts. A figure moved in the shadows near the fire. Cole. He was stirring a small pot, his movements as economical and deliberate as she remembered. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was aware she was awake. A predator always knows when the prey stirs. "You're awake," he stated, his voice the same dry rasp. He ladled a thin, grayish gruel into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. "Eat." He placed it on a crate next to the cot. Lena tried to push herself up, but a bolt of lightning shot from her broken arm, and a groan of pure agony escaped her lips. Her left arm was splinted with 2 flat pieces of wood and tied with strips of rawhide, but it was a crude, temporary binding. The bones beneath grated against each other with a sickening friction. Cole watched her, his slate gray eyes betraying nothing. No pity, no sympathy. "The arm's broken clean," he said, as if discussing the weather. "The bone needs to be set, or it'll heal crooked. You'll be a cripple." He walked back to the hearth and returned with a leather strap and a half-full bottle of whiskey. He set them down next to the gruel. "You can drink this," he said, tapping the bottle. "It'll dull the itch. Or you can bite down on this," he added, holding up the strap. "Your choice." Lena stared at him, bewildered. You're not going to set it," she whispered, her voice a fragile croak. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. "I'm not your nursemaid," Cole said, his voice flat and hard as bedrock. "I told you what this was. I'm forging a weapon. A weapon has to be able to fix itself. It has to understand its own mechanics, its own breaking points. You will set the bone." Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of her pain. He was serious. This wasn't just cruel. It was insane. "I can't," she pleaded. "I don't know how." "You'll learn," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Take your left hand with your right. Pull, hard and fast. You'll feel the bones lock into place. It'll be the worst pain you've ever felt. And then it will start to heal. Or you'll pass out and I'll do it for you. And you'll wake up knowing you failed the first test. Knowing you were too weak." He turned and walked back to his stool by the fire, his back to her, a clear dismissal. He was leaving her alone with her pain and an impossible choice. Lena looked at the whiskey, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The thought of a moment's oblivion was overwhelmingly seductive. But then she looked at Cole's rigid back. She saw the challenge in his posture. She heard the word echo in her mind, weak. Silas Kane had thought she was weak. Cletus, Finn, Bo. They had all laughed at her weakness as they rode away. The desert had feasted on her weakness. A new feeling, hard and sharp as obsidian, pushed through the fear. Anger. Not the hot, flashing anger of a woman wronged, but a cold, deep, glacial rage. She would not be weak. Not for this cold-eyed devil, and not for the ghosts she intended to hunt. She pushed the whiskey bottle away. She took the leather strap and shoved it between her teeth, biting down hard. Tears of pain and fury streamed down her face. She looked at her mangled arm, the natural angle of it sending waves of nausea through her. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Then, with a scream that was muffled by the leather, she grabbed her own broken forearm with her right hand and pulled. The world exploded into a supernova of white-hot agony. She felt a sickening, grinding pop as the bones scraped and then locked into place. Her vision tunneled. The sounds of the cabin faded into a distant roar. Blackness rushed in from the edges, and she surrendered to it, her last conscious thought not of the pain, but of the silent, rigid back of the man by the fire who had forced her to walk through hell alone. When she woke again, the sun was streaming through a small, grime-covered window. Her arm was tidily and expertly ray-splinted. The pain was still there, a deep, throbbing drumbeat, but the sharp, grinding edge was gone. Cole was gone. On the crate beside her was a fresh bowl of gruel and a tin cup of water. This became her routine. The next few weeks were a blur of pain, fitful sleep, and the slow, agonizing process of healing. Cole would come and go like a ghost, sometimes disappearing for days on end, always leaving just enough food and water for her to survive. He never spoke a word of comfort. His only form of communication was a grunt or a nod. He was an observer, a warden, watching her body mend itself, waiting. As her ribs healed and the swelling in her face subsided, she began to move. At first, it was just a few steps around the cabin, her muscles screaming in protest. Then, she forced herself outside, into the thin, cold mountain air. She was weak, a shadow of her former self, but with each step, she felt that cold flame of hatred inside her solidifying, turning from a burning coal into a core of tempered steel. The day she could walk a full circle around the cabin without stumbling, Cole was there, waiting for her by the door. "The healing's done," he announced. "The forging begins." His training was a new kind of hell, one that made her physical recovery feel like a holiday. He was relentless, a force of nature intent on stripping away every last vestige of the woman she had been. He started with her mind. "Grief is a luxury," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire, the silence stretching for an hour before he spoke. "It's a weight. You're carrying the ghost of your husband around your neck. A ghost can't pull a trigger. You need to bury him. Not in the ground. In your head. He's dead. The man you loved is a story you tell yourself. Forget the story." "I can't," she whispered, clutching a small, silver locket, one thing she'd managed to hide, the one thing they hadn't taken. It held a tiny portrait of her and John on their wedding day. Cole moved faster than she could blink. He snatched the locket from her hand, the chain breaking. Before she could protest, he tossed it into the heart of the fire. "No," she screamed, lunging for it. He caught her, his grip like iron, and held her back as she watched the silver blacken and melt, the image of their happiness turning to ash. She fought him, beating against his chest with her fists, sobs of pure anguish racking her body. He just held her, his expression unchanged, until her energy was spent and she collapsed against him, weeping. "Good," he rasped in her ear. "That is the last tear you will ever shed. From now on, that well is dry." He began to starve her, giving her just enough food to keep her alive, but leaving her in a constant state of gnawing hunger. "An empty belly makes the senses sharp," he explained. "You'll hear every twig snap. You'll smell a man on the wind a mile away." He would leave her in the wilderness with a knife and a canteen and tell her to survive. She learned to set snares, to find water, to eat things that would have made her vomit weeks before. She learned the language of the wild, a language of silence, patience, and sudden, brutal violence. He taught her how to move. He would stalk her through the dense pine forests. She would spend hours trying to be invisible, only to have him appear behind her without a sound, placing the tip of his knife against her throat. "You're dead," he would say, his voice flat. "You walk too heavy. You look at the ground. You breathe too loud," over and over, until she learned to move like a wisp of smoke, her feet barely touching the earth. And then came the guns. He didn't start her with a pistol. He started her with the long rifle. "A pistol is a weapon of passion and panic," he said, laying the heavy rifle in her hands. "A rifle is a weapon of logic, of mathematics. It teaches you patience. It teaches you that a kill is best made from a distance, where the heart stays cold." For weeks, she did nothing but shoot. He made her aim at pinnacones, at distant knots on trees, at pebbles he would toss in the air. He made her hold the rifle steady until her good arm screamed with fatigue, and then he'd make her hold it longer. He taught her to account for wind, for drop, for the rhythm of her own breathing. She learned to feel the trigger not as a switch, but as a delicate instrument. When he was finally satisfied, he brought out a pistol. It wasn't one of John's iconic Colts. Those still hung on the cabin wall, a silent testament to a skill she had not yet earned. The gun he gave her was a simple army revolver, heavy and functional. "The rifle is a tool," he said, his voice low and serious. "This is an extension of your will. It's intimate. To kill a man with this, you have to be close enough to see the surprise in his eyes. You have to be ready for that." The drills were relentless. He taught her how to draw 1,000 times until the motion was a fluid, unconscious reflex. He made her shoot while moving, while falling, in the near dark. Her hands became calloused and raw. The smell of gunpowder was permanently ingrained in her clothes and hair. She stopped dreaming of John. She started dreaming of sight pictures and trigger pulls. Lena Harper, the wife who loved the scent of baking bread and the feel of sunlight on her face, was being systematically erased. In her place, a new creature was being born. She was leaner, harder, her eyes holding the same cold, watchful light as the mountains around her. The softness was gone, burned away on the devil's anvil. One evening, after months of this brutal, relentless reforging, Cole deemed her ready for the final test. He had been gone for 2 days, and he returned just after sunset, leading a second horse. A man was slumped over the saddle, his hands and feet bound. He was a scrawny, rat-faced man with shifty eyes and a look of pure terror. Cole dragged him from the horse and threw him onto the cabin floor. "Who is he?" Lena asked, her voice as cold and flat as Cole's had ever been. "Name's Jed," Cole said, kicking the man. "Wanted in 3 territories. Ambushed a family on the Santa Fe Trail last month. Killed the parents, sold the children. He's worth $500. He paused, his slate gray eyes locking onto hers. "But his real value is here, tonight." He drew his own revolver and placed it on the table. Then he drew the army pistol she had been training with and placed it next to his. "This is your final exam," Cole said, his voice deathly quiet. "All the training, all the pain. It was all for this moment. To teach you how to do what must be done." The outlaw, Jed, began to blubber, pleading for his life, swearing he was innocent. Lena didn't even hear him. Her focus was entirely on Cole. "You have a choice," Cole continued, ignoring the man on the floor. "You can pick up that gun and kill him. You can prove that you have become what I have built, that you have the will to take a life, to deliver a reckoning. Or, you can refuse. And I will kill him, and then I will kill you. Because a weapon that hesitates, a tool that will not do its job, is a useless thing. And I have no use for useless things." The air in the cabin was thick with tension. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the pathetic sobs of the condemned man. Lena looked at the outlaw, a miserable, worthless human being. She felt no pity for him, but she felt no anger either. She felt nothing. He was just a thing, a task. She thought of Silas Kane's sneering face. She thought of the laughter as they left her to die. She thought of the locket melting in the fire. This was the price. The price for the skill, for the strength, for the chance at revenge. Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the table. Her hand did not tremble as she picked up the revolver. It felt balanced, familiar, an extension of her own arm. She turned to face the whimpering man on the floor. He stared up at her, his eyes wide with the animal terror of knowing his end was here. She raised the gun, centering the sight on his forehead, just as Cole had taught her. She let out half a breath and held it. The world narrowed to the space between the hammer and the target. In that final, silent moment, a single tear, the very last one she would ever shed, traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear for the man she was about to kill. It was a tear for the woman she had been, the woman she was now murdering along with him. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin. The outlaw's head snapped back, and he collapsed into a still, silent heap. The smell of blood and gunpowder filled the air. Lena stood there, the smoking gun held steady in her hand, the single tear drying on her face. She looked at the body, and then she looked at Cole. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, no horror. She felt only a vast, cold, and hollow emptiness. The weapon had been forged. The forge in the mountains had cooled, but the steel it had created was now ready to be tested. Lena Harper was no longer a name that belonged to her. It was a shell, an alias for the creature of purpose that now looked out at the world through her eyes. Cole gave her the first name a week after she had killed the outlaw Jed. He spoke it without ceremony, as if reading a shopping list. "Cletus Poe," he said, staring into the fire. "A dim-witted brute. Good with his fists, better with a boot. He likes whiskey, cheap women, and the sound of his own voice. He's working as an enforcer for a cattle baron named Abernathy, just outside the town of Redemption." Redemption. The irony was so thick Lena could have choked on it. She felt a flicker of something hot in the hollow space in her chest. Cletus. She remembered his piggish eyes and the cruel laughter that had rumbled in his chest as his boot connected with her ribs. He was the muscle, the blunt instrument of her destruction. Her first true target. The journey to redemption was made in near silence. They rode hard, Cole setting a relentless pace. Lena saw the world differently now. Before, she would have noticed the way the sunlight painted the mesas in hues of orange and gold. Now, she saw ambush points, sources of water, lines of sight, and escape routes. The world was no longer a home, it was a battlefield. Cole was a ghost at her side, his presence a constant, silent pressure. He offered no guidance, no strategy. He had given her the tools. It was up to her to build the coffin. Redemption was alive from the moment they saw it. From a distance, it looked prosperous, with a 2-story hotel and a freshly painted church steeple. But up close, the paint was peeling, and the prosperity was a thin veneer over a core of rot. The men who walked the dusty main street had the hard, predatory eyes of wolves who had found a flock with no shepherd. Abernathy's brand was on everything, and the law was a fat, sweating sheriff who spent most of his days in the saloon, his salary paid by the cattle baron's coin. Cole took a room at the livery, vanishing into the town's shadows. "I'm not here," was all he said. Lena was on her own. She needed a disguise, a way to get close. The woman she washer died, and silent would draw suspicion. So she resurrected a ghost of herself. She let her shoulders slump, put a desperate, weary look in her eyes, and walked into the grandly named Gilded Cage Saloon. She became a woman on her own, looking for any work to keep from starving. It was a convincing performance because, not long ago, it had been the truth. The saloon was a swirl of noise and cheap perfume. It stank of stale beer, sweat, and desperation. She got a job swabbing floors and cleaning spittoons, the kind of work that made her invisible. And from that position of invisibility, she watched. She saw him on her second night. Cletus Poe was exactly as she remembered, only larger and louder in this confined space. He sat at a corner table with other Abernathy men, his laughter a booming, obnoxious sound that dominated the room. He drank heavily, his movements sloppy and arrogant. He treated the saloon girls with a casual cruelty, his hands rough and quick to grab. Watching him, Lena felt nothing. No fear, no hot surge of rage. She simply felt the cold, dispassionate focus of a hunter observing its prey. She was cataloging his weaknesses. For 3 days, she worked and watched. She learned his routine. He drank until midnight, stumbled back to the Abernathy bunkhouse at the edge of town, and rose late. He was proud, easily goaded, and greedy. On the 4th day, she put her plan into motion. She approached him as he was leaving the saloon, her head bowed, her voice timid. "Mr. Poe." He squinted down at her, his face flushed with whiskey. "What do you want?" I heard you were one of Mr. Abernathy's most trusted men," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I overheard something. 2 of the new ranch hands. They were talking about skimming from the payroll. Said they'd stashed it in the old abandoned stable by the dry creek. Greed and suspicion warred in his drunken eyes. The idea that someone was stealing from his boss was an insult to his authority. The idea of recovering the stash for himself was a temptation he couldn't resist. "Why tell me?" he slurred, suspicious. "They laughed at me when I served them," Lena whispered, adding a believable lie. "I figured. A man like you would know what to do. Maybe put in a good word for me with the boss." That was all it took. The appeal to his ego was the final hook. "I'll handle it," he boomed, puffing out his chest. "You stay here. Don't say a word to nobody." He lumbered out of the saloon and into the darkness. Lena slipped out the back door, her heart a cold, steady drum. She took a shortcut through the alleys, her movements swift and silent. She was at the abandoned stable minutes before him, melting into the deep shadows within. The stable smelled of decay and rat droppings. Moonlight streamed through the holes in the roof, painting stripes of silver on the dusty floor. She heard his heavy footsteps approaching, his drunken muttering. He pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside, his pistol drawn. "All right, you thieving sons of," he began, his eyes trying to adjust to the gloom. "Hello, Cletus," Lena's voice said, coming from the darkness to his left. He spun around, startled, trying to locate the sound. "Who's there? Show yourself." Lena stepped out of the shadows, the army revolver in her hand, held steady and aimed at his chest. The moonlight caught her face, and for a moment, Cletus just stared, his whiskey-soaked brain struggling to make a connection. He saw a woman, lean and hard, her eyes as cold as a winter night. He didn't recognize her. "Do I know you?" he asked, his bravado wavering. "You should," Lena said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "You helped make me." She took another step forward. "The Harper homestead. A month ago. You and Silas and the others. You beat a woman, broke her, and left her for the vultures." Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of shock, and then a flicker of fear. He remembered. The woman he was looking at was impossible. A ghost? You're dead, he stammered, raising his own pistol. You should have made sure, she said. His shot was panicked and wild, the bullet splintering a support beam a foot to her left. Her shot was not. It was calm, deliberate, and perfectly aimed. The bullet took him in the knee. The sound of the shot was deafening, followed immediately by the crack of his kneecap shattering. He screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony, and collapsed to the floor, dropping his gun. Lena walked toward him, the revolver still leveled. He scrambled backward, dragging his ruined leg, leaving a smear of blood in the dust. The arrogant bully was gone, replaced by a terrified, whimpering animal. Please, he begged, holding up a hand. Please, don't. She stood over him, her shadow falling across his face. Did she beg? Lena asked, her voice a whisper of ice. The woman on the floor. Did you listen? She knelt down, bringing her face close to his, making sure he could see her eyes. She wanted him to see that the woman he had broken was gone, and that this creature, this instrument of death, was his creation. I want you to remember my face, Cletus, she said softly. I want it to be the last thing you ever see. She pressed the muzzle of the revolver against his forehead. He sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound. She pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed once and then faded, leaving only a profound silence. Lena stood up. She looked down at the body, at the ruin she had made. She waited for the satisfaction, for the feeling of release, for the warmth of vengeance. But nothing came. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness. A debt had been paid in lead, but the ledger was far from balanced. She ejected the spent casing, the metal warm in her palm. She slipped it into her pocket, a cold, brass reminder of her first step on a long, dark road. Then she turned and walked out of the stable, disappearing into the night, leaving the unredeemed town of redemption behind her. The hollowness Lena felt after killing Cletus became her constant companion on the ride north. When she met Cole at their predetermined rendezvous, he simply looked at the new, hard set of her jaw, nodded once, and handed her a piece of jerky. There was no praise, no discussion. The mission continued. Finn O'Malley, he said, 2 nights later, as they camped in a high mountain pass. Gambler. Cheater. Prefers a knife to a gun. He's paranoid, trusts no one. Last seen in Black Creek. Black Creek wasn't a town, it was a festering wound. A mining camp that had grown into a lawless collection of tents, shacks, and hastily erected saloons, all clinging to the side of a mountain scarred by the search for silver. The law here was determined by the fastest hand or the sharpest blade. It was a perfect place for a man like Finn to disappear. Lena knew her previous disguise wouldn't work. Black Creek would chew up and spit out a desperate woman. To get to a paranoid man like Finn, she had to enter his world. She had to become a player. Cole had taught her more than just survival and combat. He had drilled her in the art of deception, including the cold mathematics of poker. She rode into Black Creek alone, a new persona crafted for the occasion. She was no longer a victim. She was a predator. She wore dark, simple clothes, her hair tied back, her expression a permanent and readable mask. She called herself the Widow, a name that invited questions she never answered. She started small, in the grimmiest, most low-stakes saloon in the camp. She played for hours, her style of play unnerving the rough miners and prospectors. She was patient, disciplined, folding for hours on end, then striking with a sudden, merciless aggression. She never smiled when she won, never flinched when she lost. She simply played the odds, her face a stone carving. Word travels fast in a place like Black Creek. By the end of the week, the tale of the silent, stone-faced widow who could strip a man of his wages without a change in expression had reached the ears she intended it to. She was invited to a high-stakes game at the Silver Vein, the camp's most notorious gambling den, a place where fortunes were won and lives were lost in the turn of a single card. Finn O'Malley was there. He was a weary man with restless, darting eyes and long, nimble fingers that seemed to always be fiddling with a coin or a knife. He sat at the table like a cold snake, his paranoia a palpable aura. The game began. It was the most intense battle Lena had ever fought. It wasn't about the cards, it was about nerve. The air was thick with cigar smoke and unspoken threats. Lena focused on Finn, ignoring the other players. She met his shifty gaze with her own cold, steady one. She raised when he bluffed, folded when he was strong, slowly, methodically, taking his chips and dismantling his confidence. Her icy demeanor got under his skin. He grew agitated, his movements becoming more jerky. He was used to intimidating his opponents, not being clinically dissected by a silent woman who looked through him as if he were glass. It was in a moment of frustration, after Lena had won a particularly large pot, that he made his mistake. "Damn it," he hissed, slamming his cards down. "You got the same dead eyes as Harper did. Right before the end. Thought he could play us all with that second deal of his." He froze, realizing he had spoken out of turn. The other players didn't notice, too busy counting their losses, but Lena did. Second deal. The words hit her like a physical blow, a crack in the foundation of her entire quest for vengeance. John's death wasn't a simple gang killing. She gave no outward sign. She simply gathered her chips, her expression and changed. But inwardly, her mind was reeling. She now knew she had to keep Finn alive long enough to learn more. But her cold, relentless play had already sealed his fate in a different way. An hour later, he was bankrupted. His stack of chips was gone, transferred to hers. His face was pale with fury and humiliation. In a place like Black Creek, such a public loss was a kind of death. "You cheated," he snarled, his hand inching toward the hilt of the Bowie knife sheathed at his belt. Lena stood slowly, raking her winnings into a leather bag. "You played your cards," she said, her voice low and even. "I played mine." She looked him dead in the eye. "If you want one last hand, to win it all back, meet me out back. Just you and me." It was a direct challenge to his honor, a challenge he couldn't refuse without losing what little face he had left. His eyes narrowed with hate. He nodded once. Lena walked out into the narrow, muddy alley behind the saloon. It was a claustrophobic space, hemmed in by the backs of two buildings, filled with trash and the stench of rot. She waited in the darkness. Finn appeared moments later, a shadow detaching itself from the doorway. He didn't come to talk. He came to kill. The long blade of his Bowie knife slid from its sheath with a soft, metallic whisper. "I don't know who you are," he spat, "but you're leaving Black Creek in a box." "I'm the ghost of a homesteader, Finn," Lena said, letting him see the revolver she now held in her hand. "And you're going to tell me about the second deal." He lunged. He was impossibly fast, the knife a blur of silver in the dim light. Lena fired, but he jinked to the side, and the bullet sparked off the stone wall. He was on her, the knife slashing at her arm. She felt a searing pain as the blade cut through her sleeve and skin. She shoved him back, creating a foot of space, and fired again. The shot was deafening in the narrow alley. The bullet caught him in the gut. He grunted, stumbling back, a look of shock on his face. But he wasn't done. With a final, hate-filled roar, he lunged again. Lena didn't back away. She stood her ground, aimed for center mass, and fired twice more. The shot slammed into his chest, throwing him backward against the opposite wall. He slid to the ground, the knife clattering from his lifeless fingers. Breathing heavily, clutching her bleeding arm, Lena knelt beside him. His eyes were already glazing over. "The deal. John's deal," she demanded. A bloody, gurgling laugh escaped his lips. "He tried to betray Silas, the sharpshooter. Bo. He knows." And then he was gone. Lena stood alone in the dark, filthy alley, the words echoing in her mind. Betray Silas. Her husband, the hero of her memory, was a traitor. The simple, righteous path of her revenge had just forked, leading into a dark, tangled forest of lies she was beginning to realize she knew nothing about. Lena stitched the gash in her arm herself, using a needle and thread from her saddlebags and a bottle of cheap whiskey for antiseptic. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the turmoil in her mind. John, a traitor. The idea was a poison, seeping into the foundations of her grief and rage, corrupting everything. When she confronted Cole with what Finn had said, the bounty hunter was unmoved. He inspected her stitches with a critical eye, then looked at her. "The dead tell no tales. The living lie," he said, his voice flat. "Your husband is a ghost. Silas Kane and his men are real. Focus on the mission. Bo is next." His dismissal was cold, absolute, and it left Lena feeling more alone than ever. She was a tool, and a tool wasn't meant to ask questions. But the question was there, a splinter in her soul. Bo Latimer, the sharpshooter, was the crew's eyes and its brain. He was not a man to be found in a drunken saloon or at a poker table. He was a creature of shadows and secrets. Cole's information placed him in El Dorado, a sprawling, dusty hub town that served as the nerve center for the territory's criminal element. If you wanted to hire a gun, move stolen goods, or disappear, you went to El Dorado. To find a snake like Bo, Lena had to become a serpent herself. She rode into El Dorado and descended into its underworld. She shed the widow persona and became Alice, a quiet, observant woman who bought and sold information. She spent her days in the back rooms of saloons, in smoke-filled opium dens, and in the lobbies of fleabag hotels, listening. She learned that secrets were the town's true currency, and she became a master broker. She traded a tidbit about a crooked card game for a rumor about a planned stagecoach robbery. She sold the robbery plans to a rival gang in exchange for the name of a corrupt cavalry quartermaster. She was living a lie, 24 hours a day. Cole was her only contact, a brief, shadowy meeting once a week in the old Spanish cemetery. He would give her money and supplies, and she would report her progress. He was the one who, through his own network, gave her the key. Every man has a weakness, a string that can be pulled, he told her one night. Bo's is a woman named Clara, a singer he fell 4 years ago in St. Louis. He thinks she's dead, died of consumption. Lena spent 2 weeks meticulously crafting her trap. She bribed a telegraph operator to create a fake message. She found a woman newly arrived in town who vaguely matched Clara's description and paid her to be seen in the right places, humming a tune mentioned in an old letter of Bo's that Cole had managed to acquire. She created a ghost. Finally, she sent the bait. A carefully worded, anonymous message delivered to one of Bo's known associates. The songbird still sings. She waits where the angels sleep. Come alone. It was a reference to the abandoned Mission San Gabriel, a ruin 20 miles out of town. Lena was there 2 days before the proposed meeting. The mission was a skeleton of a building, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower a perfect sniper's nest. She didn't take the obvious position. Instead, she chose a small, collapsed alcove on the far side of the courtyard, a spot that offered a clear view of the bell tower. She knew a man like Bo would never walk into the open. He would come early, and he would take the high ground. She was not hunting him, she was hunting the hunter. For 2 days, she lay motionless, a ghost in the ruins. She lived on jerky and water, her body perfectly still, her senses alive. The waiting was a form of meditation. It burned away her distractions, her doubts, leaving only the cold, hard purpose of the kill. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, she saw it. A flicker of movement in the bell tower. A brief glint of sunlight on glass. Bo was in position, his rifle scanning the courtyard below, waiting for a ghost that would never appear. Lena slowly, carefully, raised her own rifle, the one Cole had trained her on. She settled the stock against her shoulder, the familiar weight of comfort. She found him in her sights, a dark shape in the shadowed archway of the tower. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart. The world narrowed to the small circle of her scope. She saw him lean forward, a flicker of impatience. He was realizing the trap was for him. He was a professional, and he knew something was wrong. In that moment, she fired. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The sound of the shot was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert. Through her scope, she saw the dark shape in the tower jolt, and then slump out of sight. She waited a full hour before she moved, her discipline absolute. She finally made her way to the bell tower, her revolver in her hand. Bo Latimer was alive, but only just. The bullet had taken him high in the chest. He lay in a pool of his own blood, his sniper rifle just out of his reach. His eyes, even in death, were sharp and intelligent. He looked up at her, a flicker of professional respect mixed with bitter irony. The songbird, he rasped, a bloody smile on his lips. Well played, John Harper, Lena said, her voice hard. Finn said he was going to betray Silas. Tell me. Bo coughed, a wet, rattling sound. Your husband had ambition, he wheezed. A fatal flaw in our line of work. He wasn't just working for Silas. He was playing a deeper game. A railroad payroll. He wanted the whole pie for himself. Silas just collected the debt. The confirmation hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. The story was true. Her husband, the man whose memory she had sanctified, was a common thief who had gotten in over his head. Her entire, bloody quest was for nothing. Bo's eyes glazed over, his last breath rattling in his chest. Lena stood in the silent bell tower, the truth a heavier weight than any of the bodies she had left in her wake. She was 3 for 3. Her targets were dead, but her world had never been more of a ruin. She looked out at the endless and forgiving desert, and for the first time, she felt a kinship with it. Vast, empty, and haunted by the ghosts of a lie. The truth about her husband was a cancer in Lena's soul, eating away at the foundations of her rage. For a time, she was adrift. The cold purpose that had driven her was now tainted with the bitter taste of betrayal. Bo's dying words had confirmed it. She was avenging a lie. Cole found her staring into a campfire, the rifle across her lap, her eyes seeing a past that was now a ruin. He sat down, the silence stretching. He did not offer comfort. He offered a target. "Silas Kane," he said, his voice cutting through her reverie. "He knows you're coming. He's holed up at the old Bar W Ranch, Box Canyon. One way in, one way out. He's hired a dozen guns, turned it into a fortress." A part of Lena wanted to quit, to ride away and let the ghosts of the past bury themselves. But the creature that Cole had forged had only one function. The mission was not about John anymore. It was about finishing the ledger. It was about the woman who had been beaten and left to die in the desert. This final act was for her. "We'll need a plan," she said, her voice flat, the fire back in her eyes, colder and harder than before. They spent 2 weeks in the bluffs overlooking the canyon, living like wolves. They watched the Bar W Ranch, their world shrinking to this single, dusty bowl of rock and death. They mapped every routine, every guard patrol, every shadow. They learned the rhythms of the fortress, the timing of the changing of the guards, the location of the dynamite shed. A direct assault was suicide. They would not be a flood. They would be the plague. Their chance came on the 3rd week in the form of a massive, rolling thunderstorm that the plainsmen called a skybreaker. The wind howled, kicking up a blinding wall of dust. And the sky was a bruised purple, pregnant with rain and lightning. "Tonight," Cole said. It was the only word needed. Under the cover of the screaming wind and the first fat drops of rain, they moved. They were to ghosts, to wraiths of vengeance slipping through the maelstrom. They infiltrated the canyon, not through the heavily guarded entrance, but by scaling a treacherous section of the canyon wall Cole had identified. A feat of strength and nerve that would have been impossible for the woman Lena once was. The assault was a masterpiece of silent, coordinated violence. They moved through the ranch like two halves of the same lethal organism. Cole, with his knife and Garrett, was a whisper of death in the shadows, taking out the sentries on the perimeter with brutal efficiency. Lena, armed with her revolver and a profound understanding of ambush, became a phantom in the chaos of the storm. She took the first 2 guards near the bunkhouse, using a lightning strike to mask the sound of her shots. She moved to the dynamite shed, planted a small charge with a long fuse, and continued her silent purge. She was no longer just a student following a mentor. She was his equal, a seamless partner in the art of death. The men Silas Kane had hired were tough, but they were expecting an army, not a ghost. They were looking for a threat from the outside, not realizing death was already inside the walls with them. The dynamite charge went off, blowing the shed and the nearby stable to splinters, a massive, fiery diversion that drew half the remaining men toward the blaze. In the confusion, Lena and Cole struck from the opposite direction, their guns blazing in the pouring rain. The firefight was a chaotic, close-quarters ballet of muzzle flashes and falling bodies. Lena moved with an almost supernatural calm. The screams, the explosions, the thunder, it was all just noise. Her world was a series of targets. A man firing from a doorway, a shadow moving on a rooftop. She dispatched them with a cold, mechanical precision that was terrifying to behold. Within minutes, the courtyard was silent, save for the hiss of the rain on the fire and the moans of the dying. A dozen hired guns were dead or dying. The path to the main ranch house was clear. The path to Silas Kane. Lena kicked open the door to the house. Inside, lamps were lit. Silas Kane stood behind a large oak desk, a shotgun in his hands, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The jagged scar over his eye was a livid white against his flushed skin. "The bitch from the desert," he snarled. I should have put a bullet in your head myself. You should have, Lena said, raising her revolver, the water dripping from her hat, her eyes burning with a cold fire. But before she could pull the trigger, a voice boomed from the doorway behind her. Drop the guns. All of you. Lena froze. Standing there, soaked to the bone, was a man with a silver star pinned to his vest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his face, grim and determined, was known throughout the territory. Marshal Evans. A man famous for two things, his incorruptibility and his relentless pursuit of justice. And flanking him were 4 armed deputies. The room was suddenly a powder keg with a dozen lit fuses. Silas Kane had his shotgun aimed at Lena. Lena had her revolver aimed at Kane. And Marshal Evans and his deputies had their guns aimed at everyone. The only sound was the drumming of the rain on the roof. Kane, the marshal said, his voice a low growl of authority. You're a hard man to find. There's a warrant for you from 3 territories. It's over. Not while this bitch is still breathing, Silas spat, his knuckles white on the shotgun. Lena didn't move. Her entire being was focused on the man behind the desk. The law, justice, those were abstract concepts. The man who had destroyed her life was 3 seconds from a grave. Then the marshal's gaze shifted, moving past Lena to the shadows near the door where Cole had just materialized. Evans's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features. Cole, the marshal said, his voice laced with disbelief. I'll be damned. I never thought I'd see you again. Not after you took the bounty on John Harper. The words hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. Her gun didn't waver, but her entire world tilted on its axis. She didn't turn. She couldn't. But her mind reeled, trying to process the impossible sentence. The bounty on John Harper. What? She breathed, the word barely audible. Cole stepped out of the shadows, his face an unreadable mask. His hands held carefully away from his guns. Hello, Evans, he said, his voice calm. Long time. You have no idea, the marshal growled, his gun now trained squarely on Cole. I've been hunting Kane's operation for a year. Every time I got close, my witnesses would disappear. My leads would dry up. It was like a ghost was cleaning up the mess ahead of me. That was you, wasn't it? Picking off the stragglers. The pieces began to click into place in Lena's mind, forming a picture of such cold, manipulative brilliance that it stole her breath. Cole. He hadn't stumbled upon her in the desert by chance. He hadn't saved her out of pity or because he saw some raw potential in her. He was a bounty hunter. The best. He had been hired by Kane's rivals to hunt and kill her husband. When Kane killed John first, the bounty likely shifted to Kane and his entire crew. But taking them all down at their fortress was a suicide mission for one man. So, he had found the perfect tool. A broken, vengeful widow with a legitimate grievance. He had picked her up, reforged her, aimed her, and pulled the trigger. Cletus, Finn, Bosch hadn't been an avenger. She had been his hunting dog, flushing the birds out of the bush so he could claim the prize. He had let her do the dirty, impossible work of dismantling Kane's network from the inside out, and now, here he was, ready to claim the final, massive bounty on Silas Kane himself. He hadn't been training a partner. He had been priming a pawn. You, Lena whispered, the single word dripping with a venom colder than any she had felt for Silas Kane. Her aim shifted fractionally, moving from Kane to the man who had been her creator, her mentor, her devil. Cole looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his slate gray eyes. Not remorse, not guilt, but the cool, detached assessment of a master strategist whose most volatile piece on the board had just become self-aware. Silas Kane, seeing the entire dynamic shift, let out a harsh, barking laugh that was utterly devoid of humor. You see, Marshal, the whole world's a snake eating its own tail, he roared, his eyes wild. She didn't even know. He reveled in the moment, a master of ceremonies at the theater of the damned. Her husband, John Harper, the man she's been killing for. He was no saint. He was a goddamn snake in the grass. Kane's words tumbled out, a final, venomous confession. He filled in the missing pieces, painting a portrait of John Harper that shattered the last, fragile remnants of Lena's memory. John hadn't just been a gunslinger, he was a deep cover agent, hired by a rival railroad baron, a man named Leviticus Thorne, to infiltrate and destroy Kane's operation. which had been sabotaging Thorne's westward expansion. But your husband got greedy. Cain sneered at Lena. He saw the big picture. He found out where I was keeping Thorne's stolen payroll of fortune in gold coin. He decided to play both sides against the middle. He was going to steal the payroll from me, kill my crew, and disappear, leaving me and Thorne to tear each other apart. He was a traitor twice over. The second deal Finn had mentioned. The deeper game Bo had gasped about. It all made a sickening kind of sense. John hadn't been betrayed by his partners in crime. He had been executed by them when they discovered his own betrayal. I just collected the debt he owed, Cain finished, a triumphant look on his face. And you, little lady, he said, his gaze fixing on Lena. You were just the fool he left behind. The revelation did not break Lena. She had already been broken, reforged, and broken again. The news landed not on a grieving widow, but on the cold, hard anvil of the creature Cole had created. Her entire quest, the righteous fury that had fueled her, was built on a lie. Her home hadn't been destroyed by monsters who had targeted a hero. It was the inevitable, bloody fallout of a dangerous game her husband had chosen to play and lost. She wasn't an avenging angel. She was collateral damage. The world seemed to slow down. The drumming of the rain, the shouts of the deputies, the sneering face of Knut all faded into a dull roar. The only thing that was clear was the cold, hard truth. She was alone. She had always been alone. In the split second of silence that followed Cain's revelation, Lena made a choice. Her rage, now untethered from the lie of her husband, needed a target. It found one. Not the man who had killed her husband, but the man who had used her grief as a weapon. Her gun, which had been wavering between Cain and Cole, settled firmly on Cole. You knew, she said, her voice a dead whisper. All of it. You knew what he was, and you used me. It was a means to an end, Cole stated, his voice as calm as ever. He was a liar. They were killers. You were a tool. The math was simple. That was the moment the powder keg blew. The first shot was not Lena's. It was Silas Cain's. Seeing his two main threats now aimed at each other, he saw his chance. He swung the shotgun not at Lena, but at the marshal, the biggest symbol of authority in the room. The house erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire. The marshal took the buckshot in the shoulder, staggering back. His deputies opened fire on Cain. Cole, moving with a speed that defied his age, ducked for cover, drawing his own pistols. Lena did not participate in the chaos. The gunfight was a storm around her, but she was the eye of the hurricane, perfectly still. Her war was not with Cain anymore. His crimes were almost incidental now. She watched as Cain, riddled with bullets from the deputies, collapsed over his desk, his shotgun clattering to the floor. She watched as Cole, from his position of cover, took down two of the deputies with cold, efficient shots, clearing the board of anyone who might interfere with his prize. And then it was just the three of them left standing, the wounded Marshal, Cole, and Lena. It's over, Cole, the marshal grunted, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Not yet, Cole said, his guns now aimed at the marshal. But Lena had already moved. While the two men were focused on each other, she had simply turned and walked away. She slipped out the back door of the ranch house, into the pouring rain and the darkness. She didn't run. She just walked. She walked past the bodies in the courtyard, past the burning remnants of the stable. She walked out of the Bar W Ranch, out of the canyon, and into the desert. She abandoned it all. The vengeance, the mentor, the past. She just walked away. The days that followed were a waking dream. She wandered the desert, a ghost in her own life. The skills Cole had taught her kept her alive of finding water, hunting small game, but she was running on instinct alone. Her mind was a wasteland. She was a weapon without a purpose, a finely honed tool designed for a job that no longer existed. She was haunted not by what had been done to her, but by the lies she had dedicated her new life to avenging. Who was she, if not John Harper's widow? Who was she, if not Cole's instrument of vengeance? The rain had washed the blood away, but she couldn't wash away the truth. She nearly gave up. Lying under the stars one night, the cold of the desert seeping into her bones, she considered simply letting go, letting the desert finish the job it had started months ago. But then, something shifted. A new thought, hard and clear as crystal, rose from the ashes of her despair. It didn't matter who John was. It didn't matter why Cole had saved her. The pain inflicted upon her was real. Her suffering was her own. She had been beaten. She had been broken. She had been left for dead. And she had crawled her way back. Her vengeance, she finally understood, had never truly been for John. It had to be for herself. It was the only thing that was real. In the heart of that vast, empty desert, Lena Harper was reborn for a second time. Not as a grieving wife, not as a remorseless tool, but as something new, an independent and unbroken force of will. She had a final debt to collect. Lena's new purpose gave her a clarity she had never known. She emerged from the desert not as a ghost, but as a reckoning. She learned through the criminal grapevine that Marshall Evans had survived. Cole, however, had vanished, along with any trace of the stolen railroad payroll, which he had obviously located using information from Kane's study. The bounties on Kane and his men had been paid to a proxy. Cole had won. She knew he would not linger in the territory. He would take his fortune and disappear. There was only one way out that was fast enough: the railroad. She tracked him to Terminus, a remote border town whose only reason for existence was the train station that connected the territory to the east. She found him on the platform, waiting for the morning express. He was no longer the dusty bounty hunter. He was dressed in a fine new suit, his bags at his feet, looking for all the world like a successful cattleman retiring to a life of ease. He saw her coming. He didn't look surprised, merely resigned. A final loose end. The final confrontation was not a showdown at high noon. It was a quiet, tense conversation on a windswept platform, the steam from the waiting engine hissing around them. "Lena," he said, his voice even. "I figured you might come." "The payroll, Cole," she said, her voice calm. "And the bounty money." He actually smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "It was a business transaction. You got your revenge. I got my fee. I'd say we're even." He gestured to one of his bags. "But I'm not an unreasonable man. I'll give you a share. Enough to start a new life. Disappear." "I'm not here for the money," Lena said. "And I'm done disappearing. This is about closing the ledger. The real one. The one between you and me. You took a broken woman and turned her into a killer for your own profit. You used her pain as a tool. There's a debt for that." She did not draw her gun. She simply stood there, her presence a final judgment. Cole sighed, a long, weary sound. He had underestimated the steel he had forged. "There's no other way this ends, is there?" "No," she said. His hand blurred, moving for the pistol hidden in his new coat. He was fast, legendary fast. But Lena was faster. She was not driven by profit or survival. She was driven by a purpose so pure and cold it was absolute. Her draw was a single, fluid motion. Her shot was a single, deafening crack. The bullet did not kill him. It punched through his gun hand, shattering the bones, sending his pistol clattering across the wooden platform. He cried out a raw, animal sound of pain, clutching his ruined hand. The instrument of his trade, of his entire life, was destroyed. Lena walked past him and picked up the heavy bags containing the money. She turned back to him, leaving him broken and defeated on the platform, his new life bleeding out onto the dusty wood. "Like I said," she told him, her voice as empty and vast as the desert she had conquered. "This was never about the money. She did not keep it. She left it with the station master, with an anonymous note detailing that it was the stolen payroll and bounty money, to be returned to the railroad and the families of the deputies Cole had killed." Lena Harper, no longer a wife, a victim, or a weapon, bought a one-way ticket for the westbound train. As the whistle blew and the train began to pull away from the station, she didn't look back. She rode into the sunset, her future unwritten, her past finally, truly, and on her own terms, buried.